While people are getting seated on the stage, let me just introduce them and with the subject. We are just embarking, and this is the first meeting of a project here, and we observe from things that we have run into that the world is changing rapidly and radically. And so we're trying to figure out how to understand it better, and then on the basis of that, what we might do about it. So the way we're going about it is initially we're going to say, what's the impact on Russia? What's the impact on China and so on around the world? And this is our first one, and we've been having a discussion all day long about Russia and what's happening there and what to make of it from our standpoint. And these are the people who have written the papers that we've discussed, and they're going to put on a show for us. Maria on the far end has come all the way from Russia. She is representing the former foreign minister of Russia, who's written a paper for this, and others have lots of experience. So I'll turn it over to Cory Shock, who has been chairing this all day, and will chair the meeting here this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Secretary Shultz. For those of you sitting in the back, the front pews are equally comfortable and you can hear better, so you should not hesitate to move forward. I would encourage you to do so. I'm Cory Shock, the Deputy Director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies and an alumnus of the Hoover Institution, and I have the great good fortune to be surrounded by some outstanding scholars of Russia today who are going to teach you all and me about their thoughts on what's going on in Russia, trade-offs between stability and modernity and innovation and the challenges of Russian demography. It's a really rich agenda we have, and they all four have written outstanding papers on them. I'm going to run down the line quickly and introduce them to you. Maria George already started off. Maria Smeklova, she is the chair of cyber issues at the Russian International Affairs Council, and she presented not one but 3 papers she and her colleagues have worked on various aspects of contemporary Russia. Ambassador Mike McFaul, known to all of you, not only as a fellow of the Hoover Institution, but as the head of the Freeman Spogli Institute and a professor of political science here at Stanford University. Stephen Kotkin, who teaches at a small college somewhere east of the Rockies, the great scholar of the Stalin years and policy advisor on a range of issues. And the great David Holloway, scholar of the Soviet nuclear program, newly retired professor of history here at Stanford University, and fellow of the Freeman Spogli Institute. What a menu of riches you have in front of you, my friends, and I'm very excited to, Maria, start with you. Tell us a little bit about the papers that you were presenting, in particular about the demographic challenges of Russia and how you think that affects the challenges of governance.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. In case there are some Russians in the room, I'd say добрый день. Well, the 3 papers I talked about this morning cover the 3 very different yet somehow interrelated topics. The first one would be the world order and Russia's place in it, and how its international stance going to affect its foreign policy in the future. It was prepared by former Minister Ivanov. The second paper was on economy and how Russia has been developing, or not so much, internally, especially with the technological development going at the moment. And the third part was written by Professor Vishnevsky, and it covers the demographic aspects of what's going on in Russia. So not to be too long, I'll go ahead and just answer your question on demography. What we are facing at the moment in Russia is the big aging of the population. The proportion of elderly people is extremely high compared to the younger ones, and the new pension reform, as maybe some of you have heard, has been just approved, and the things are getting much intense when it comes to talking pensions. When it comes to young people, there is what's called brain drain, and a lot of young people, especially those who are interested in technology, are moving elsewhere. And here, Silicon Valley is just the place you can hear a lot of people speaking Russian on the streets, what I've heard. And at the same time, we do have a migration flow that comes to Russia, but unfortunately, the majority of people that do come to live and work to our country are those who come from former Soviet Union countries, and they're mostly low-skilled workforce that cannot substitute for the people, the professionals who are leaving to live in different countries. So that would be the biggest problem for the country at the moment, and they're working on stimulating the education process to bring more professionals when it comes to academia especially, and the new technologies we've been discussing this morning have very big say in this. So that would be it.
Excellent. Professor McFaul, you have lived the challenge of Russian society under the Putin administration from your time as ambassador there. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the subject that you wrestled with in your paper about the policy choices that the Putin government has made, especially since 2003. Walk us through the history of what changes between a Russia that was open and globally engaged before 2003, and then the milestones of policy choice that make it more challenging now for Russia to engage in the kind of economy that its leadership says they want.
Okay, first of all, thanks for having me. Second, I want to say right now, so that it's not misinterpreted, that at 4:30 I need to leave. I'm hosting a party for 400 people that begins at 4 o'clock, and I'm supposed to give remarks actually at 4 o'clock, but I'm going to do it at 4:30. So if there's something going on here and I leave, it's not because I disagree, okay? Just to make that clear. So Kori gets to the thrust of my paper that I wrote for this conference, and man, we've been worked hard, by the way. We've been at it for 8 hours, and now we're performing again. No free lunch with George Shultz.
Not.
But I want to start by just reminding you in terms of level setting, as I do in the paper, before we get into the problems of Russia, let's remember that Russians today are richer probably than in any time in their history. So it's always a compared to what question, and just some figures. GDP per capita today is at 12,000, down from a peak of 16,000 in 2013. That's because of the sanctions and other things. But that is a very high rate, higher probably than in Russian history. They've had fantastic growth over the last 20 years. And most Russians in opinion polls talk about that they feel better off today than they did 30 years ago. And even on like human dimension things and consumer goods, Russians have more of those kinds of things than any time in their history. And yet, I try to argue in my paper rather provocatively that Russia's still underperforming, that they could be doing much, much better. And in particular, as I was assigned for the paper, I look at the role of technology, the use of technology, both across the economy and then in the particular high-tech sectors. And Russia's underperforming by a lot of measures, which I won't go into now. The other paper writers also commented on this, but both the adaptation of technology in old firms is lower and slower than most G20 countries. And two, there is no Silicon Valley in Russia, and there should be a Silicon Valley in Russia. By the way, there's a Silicon Valley in Israel, made predominantly of immigrants, and here you're hearing a lot of Russian because there are 60,000 Russians here. There should be, at least that's the argument on my paper, there's a lot of potential, and so what happened? Why hasn't Russia reached its potential? And I argue with between kind of legacy arguments and policy, but I come down on the policy side and two or three are most important. First of all, it's not a great inheritance to have an autarkic command economy to build entrepreneurship and technology, right? I acknowledge that in the paper. But the Soviet system did do a pretty good job in developing human capital, and even the military-industrial complex, as we talked about in our conference today, created a basis perhaps for the emergence of high-tech firms and technology within the economy. And there are pockets of excellence in Russia. I want to keep stressing that. Many countries in the world do not have search anymore. Russia does. They've managed to keep Yandex as a company. It's one of the few companies in the world that can compete with Google inside its country. VKontakte also exists. I see Alex Stamos here. He might say that they just stole it from Facebook. That's true. But VKontakte is a company that it survives. It's one of the few companies in the world that has withstood competition from Facebook. And I could go through others. So there are pockets of it. But overall, it's failing, and why is it failing? And I point at policy decisions made that have created a negative institutional environment for the emergence of high-tech companies and the use of technology and entrepreneurship more generally. Let me just mention three and stop. One has to do with property rights and the way that Russia privatized its firms, starting in the 90s, and then accelerated by the way that Mr. Putin, President Putin, redistributed property beginning in the 2000s, and especially, I think, after 2003, with the arrest of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, the richest man in Russia at the time, has created an unstable environment for investment. Property rights are not guaranteed by the rule of law or disinterested parties in Russia. They are guaranteed by the state and by the Kremlin and by Vladimir Putin. That creates a negative environment for investment, especially in high-tech firms. I'm going to come back to that. Number two, rule of law just has not been progress in the ways that were needed to create this environment. And then number three, I would add just democracy generally. Russia has become less democratic over the last 15 years, going back to the period you described. And that means that autocrats, sometimes benevolent autocrats, can choose and have grand strategies to do good things for the economy, but a lot of times they don't. And there's a lot of variation on that, and I would say those conditions have chased away capital, have chased away brains, back to your point. And here, let me just take an abstract thing and illustrate it with two firms one firm I'm going to mention, and one I'm going to allude to that they wouldn't want me to name their company. So if you're in the oil business, you have to be in Russia. You have no choice. ExxonMobil, I used to work with that company fairly closely. You don't get to choose where, you don't get to work in Palo Alto, by the way.
You get to choose where oil is.
Yeah, you don't get to choose where oil is. You got to go to places like Angola and Russia and Kazakhstan. And so you have to go there. You have to work with whatever the institutional environment is. Oh, and by the way, companies like ExxonMobil, they have departments of what they call government relations, right? That's because they need to have relations, they need to protect their property rights, not through things like courts and the rule of law system, but through personal relationships. If you're in the high-tech firm business, you don't have to go to Russia. You actually don't have to go anywhere. You can just sit in Menlo Park for your entire life. There's plenty of ideas here. There's plenty of opportunities here. You don't have to go to Russia or anywhere else. So the permissive conditions are already here, which puts more pressure on places like Russia to have even better conditions for that kind of investment, and that's not there. And then the second piece is, for you, the most important factor for a high-tech industries are smart people. There's a problem with that factor. Unlike oil that's stuck in the ground and you have to go there to work with it, that factor can get up and leave literally in 24 hours. You just buy a plane ticket. And that can leave and go where the opportunity is. And so that's what you see in Russia, both in terms of brains, but also in terms of capital flight. And those conditions, I think, are the things that are impeding Russia from doing as well as it could. And then the third one I talk about in the paper is just Putin's foreign policy. As a result of his violations of sovereignty in Ukraine, in the United States, in the UK recently, there are sanctions against Russia. There is a confrontation there. He just today announced, put on all the sanctions you want, the West, put it all on, because that's going to help us develop our own domestic companies. He literally just said that this morning. And it seems to me we have a test of that. There was something called the Soviet Union that was also disconnected from the outside world, and for a while it did okay. But in the 21st century, do we really believe that being disconnected from capital and ideas and technology is a growth pattern for the 21st century? I don't think so, and I would add, therefore, foreign policy as another impediment to the development of technology both across the economy and the high-tech sector in particular inside Russia. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. Stephen, one of the things I really liked about your paper was you talked about the unevenness of Russian technological competence, and you used the example of doping in the Olympics. Will you spool that out? Tell people the story, because I think that's a really interesting illustration, both of areas of excellence, but also a concrete illustration of the kinds of policy choices that Mike talks about that are holding back Russia reaching the potential for innovation that they've set for themselves.
Good afternoon, Stanford. It's great to be here. The Russia story is a difficult one to unravel. If you've seen Icarus, the documentary which won an Academy Award about Russian foiling of the doping by substituting clean samples for the actual samples, doing it in a way that people still don't understand, because the caps on the samples could not be taken off without breaking them, and then therefore you couldn't restore them. The Russians figured out how to take off the caps, switch the samples from the actual one to a clean one, and then get the caps back on. And so it's a story of Russian cheating, but it's also a story of Russian ingenuity. The ability to cheat, the ability to break the law, to violate international norms, we understand that, and the film seems to be yet another confirmation of that. However, the film has a deeper meaning, for me at least, which is about the fact that the Russians should not be underestimated. They have tremendous ingenuity. You can argue that the ingenuity is not being put to constructive purposes all the time, but it would be a mistake to, I think, underestimate them. Let's take a quick big picture view of this. So what is modern history? Modern history is acquiring state-of-the-art Western technology, but quarantining Western values and institutions. We want your technology, we don't want your rule of law, we don't want your accountability, we don't want your transparency. And we have thought, this is what China does, this is what Russia does, this is what all of world history has been up to for the past couple of 100 years. It has been our assumption that this can't work, that you can't have the high tech, you can't have the technological advancement if you don't have the corresponding institutions. But the authoritarian regimes beg to differ. They think you can have the high tech and stay unaccountable vis-a-vis your population. You can quarantine the Western values, rule of law, democratic institutions. So far, the authoritarians today seem to be winning that argument. Whether that's going to continue going forward remains to be seen. But they have surprised us with their ability to compete technologically while not adopting the kinds of institutions that we think are necessary for innovation. They have censorship, right? They have state control. They have things which shouldn't be conducive to technological performance. So if you look at, for example, the internet, social media, the communications revolution, many people argue that this would force democratization on the world, including in authoritarian regimes. And to a certain extent, that has been true. However, only to a certain extent. It has been the case that authoritarian regimes have learned how to use these technologies, not just to keep them at bay, but to turn them to their advantage, as we saw to a certain extent in the Russian intervention in the American political process in the 2016 election. Now, without exaggerating Russia's effects on the election, without exaggerating how much they actually did do what we think they did, we can argue about the details. I take no position on that. My point is only that technology cuts in multiple directions. And so when Secretary Shultz assigned us the topic of the disruption on governance of technological change, that's what we're here to talk about. It turns out that there's been a lot of disruption of democratic governance by the technological change, and some of that disruption is coming from authoritarian mastery of the new technologies. Whether they created it or they just borrowed it, they just purchased it, they're able to put it to their use. However, it doesn't only cut in that direction. If you look at Russia's demographic shortfall, it's very severe. The population is aging, it's not that healthy, and things are not improving. Immigration, to a certain extent, helps them, but they have outflow, brain drain of their more talented people, as was alluded to earlier by Maria. However, if you get robotics, if you introduce robotics broadly in the economy, then not having enough people could be an advantage, because then you have less displacement, fewer workers displaced by the introduction of robotics. So the weakness of poor demography could actually become a strength if robotics were to spread broadly in the Russian economy. This is not happening, as Professor Holloway has pointed out in his paper, and maybe he'll get into a deeper conversation of this. There is no significant dissemination of robots in manufacturing in the Russian economy. Now, technology, as I say, cuts in multiple ways. One of the ways the Russian authoritarian regime remains in power is because it has very good cash flow. It's able to buy off the population, it's able to pay off the elites, it's able to acquire military technology because it has hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons play less of a role in the Russian economy than we sometimes think, but they play more of a role in Russian government finances than we sometimes understand. The Russian government couldn't survive without those hydrocarbon revenues. So if some of you here at Stanford can scale renewables from 5% or 7% of global energy, which is where it's right now, if you can push renewables to some of the predictions of where we would be right now, 50%, 70%, 80%, this would upend politics in Russia. The authoritarian regime would be, the rug would be pulled out from under them, not only in Russia, but potentially in other authoritarian hydrocarbon states, such as we see in the Middle East. So these are some of the issues that we've been discussing, and my larger point to answer Professor Shake's question is that Russia looks like it's in very deep trouble, and it is, but we are potentially going to be surprised, as we have been in the past, and just as we have been by the internet and social media, judo style being reversed against us. That's not a prediction that the Russian regime is stable and will go on to greatness, but I wouldn't necessarily predict a fundamental collapse short of a massive introduction of renewables in the hydrocarbon sphere. So when we talk about technology's implications, its influence on governance, it is having an enormous influence on governance, but it's a multi-directional influence, and it's uncertain and hard to predict the future.
I think I just heard a policy proposal that produces regime change without climate change, which is a difficult needle to thread, so congratulations there. David, could you talk some about sources of legitimacy in the Russian government and how they've been changing over time?
So the project that we had a very good discussion today. The overall project that we're looking at, as has already been made clear, is to consider the fantastic technological changes that we're going through in the world and prospective changes. I mean, from smartphones to artificial intelligence in its various forms, and to take into account climate change and demographic change, and see how different states, in this case Russia, is affected by these changes and responding to them. And I think the first thing I'd like to stress is that, of course, Russia itself has gone through, in the last 30 years, an enormous change in its governance. Collapse of the Soviet Union, creation of a new Russian state, a dramatic fall by close to 50% in the gross domestic product in the 1990s and early 2000s. This was a social trauma which was registered in the population by the remarkable decline in life expectancy for men from about, I think it fell as low as 57 years in the late 1980s, and then has now recovered to about 66 or 67 years, still very low by international standards, and a significant gender gap because the life expectancy for women has remained much higher, so that Russia overall now has just entered the group of societies where average life expectancy at birth is just over 70 years. And this has enormous importance for Russia now and importance for Russia in the future. But the main point I want to make is that Russia went through an extremely tense and complex period in the 1990s. And the argument I want to make is that the recovery from this, the kind of stabilization that has taken place under, largely under President Putin, that this system that now exists, many people are arguing, it forces Russia to a choice between the stability of this kind and technological innovation and the ability to cope with new technologies. And I'll illustrate that by referring to a study done by a former finance minister, Andrei Kudrin, on how to move Russia. Russia enjoyed the kind of collapse of the economy in the 1990s, maybe enjoyed is not the word, but suffered a collapse of the economy, recovery in the early 2000s, but over the last few years has been growing at a relatively low rate, not the 7% that was earlier, but at 1 to 2%. And so the report by Kudrin was to address the question of how to raise Russia's rate of economic growth. The argument was that Russia was now in a long-term, if nothing was done, Russia could look forward to a long period of close to stagnation, of slow economic growth. And Kudrin's report said some of this has to do with sanctions, some of it has to do with demographic problems, but the major issues are really to do with institutions inside Russia itself. That there needed to be reform of government administration, reform of education, and in particular reform of the judicial system so that court decisions wouldn't be decided by bribes or pressure on the judges. So this, I think the importance of this is that it shows, if you like, a debate about what is the appropriate kind of governance that you need for when you have these new technologies on the way. Because Kudrin's main complaint, as it were, our main concern, was Russia's lag in technology. And he says in his report, this is more serious than any military threat to us, more serious than any geopolitical threat, is how can we become innovative? And he quotes a number of statistics to illustrate Russia's technological backwardness. And one of the statistics has to do with the point that Professor Kotkin mentioned. There is a group called the International Federation of Robotics, which puts together an annual index for different countries of the number of multi-function robots those in the industry has per 10,000 workers. And in 2016, I may get the figure slightly wrong, the world average was 74 such robots per 10,000 workers. The most automated country is South Korea with about 630. The US has about 190, and Russia had 3. And you would think, it was the point that you made, with a demographic shift and a very rapid reduction, about 1 million a year in the working age population, that automation, robotics, would be a way to go to try to deal with this. But that hasn't happened. That was one of the indicators he used to point to Russia's technological backwardness. So on the demographic front, we have a declining population. The life expectancy has improved in recent years. Government says they will take steps to ensure it will continue to improve. And of course, one hopes that that will be the case. If we look at information technologies, here my comment, I think Professor Kotkin is right, the technologies don't have some, as it were, automatic impact. We talked about technologies of liberation, but new technologies are also technologies of repression. I was about a year ago in Leipzig in a Stasi museum, and I was astonished at how primitive their record keeping and data collection was. Lots of index cards. And they had developed a camera, a very sophisticated camera, so that they could take a photograph of the registration plate of every car coming into East Germany. And I thought, come on, this is light years away from what would be what the potential would be today. So making predictions of change in a specific direction on the basis of technology can be a risky proposition. If we look at climate change, again, Russia, of course, is very complex because it's such a large country. Climate change can have many different effects. One of the effects it's having already is, of course, to open up the Arctic for mining and for transport. In his speech to the Federal Assembly in March, Putin made the point that this was going to be the way in which the Far East would be developed, through the opening up of the Arctic and transport in that way. So let me finally come to the question that Professor Shock asked me. I haven't forgotten it, I was just pushing it off. I think in the early years, stabilization is important. The experience of the 90s, the late 80s and the 90s, in terms of food supply, of wages not being paid, of high rates of inflation, pensions not being paid, those were tough memories for many people in Russia. Stabilization involving payment of wages, payment of pensions, certainly in the early part of the century, a kind of steady increase in standards of living. This stabilization was, I think, very important, and as far as we can tell, it's the basis of the support that President Putin enjoys. The question then is, when the economy is not growing in that way, things are not improving in that way, can we still say that there's a link between legitimacy or support and economic growth? We don't seem to have seen a break there, but I think it's important to realize that, of course, there are other elements of legitimacy. Legitimacy through stressing cultural values, the role of the Russian Orthodox Church in supporting Russian identity, and also, perhaps most worryingly, legitimation through successful foreign policy moves, notably the annexation of Crimea. So we see, I think, a more complex Russia. We see a debate of a kind about what's the appropriate kind of governance to have when we're moving into these technological revolutions. And we see, on the one hand, I agree with what Steve Kotkin said, yes, Russia has great traditions in science and technology, but also a worry about technological backwardness and not being able to keep up with the technological progress. In his speech to the Federal Assembly in March, Putin actually took quite a lot from the language of the Kudrin report. He stressed that technological backwardness was the main threat, not the military threat, not geopolitics, and made the comment that those who ride the technological wave, will make great progress. Those who don't ride it or can't ride it will fall off and be drowned. The implication being, of course, that Russia would take steps to do that, but yet we don't see the steps. So the issue is whether, as it were, the language and the aspirations and the goals are there, but maybe the steps that, at least in Kudrin's recommendation, should be taken, that those steps are just too difficult, too awkward to take. And that, I think, represents an interesting and complex dynamic when we think about Russia governance and technology.
Excellent. So Maria, you ride the waves of technological innovation as a cyber expert. Do you agree with that assessment of Russia's shortfalls in that area? Maybe talk a little bit about Russian experiments to generate a Silicon Valley of its own, or efforts to try and spur the kind of change that David has just said Russian rhetoric is tending strongly towards in the government?
Okay, well, to start with technology and technological backwardness, we discussed throughout the day and in the morning. Well, first of all, I do agree with the idea that the technological backwardness in Russia is now determined by the fact that all the investment and all the stress in this industry is stuck in the military sphere. Instead of pushing forward the startups, the smaller enterprise, any form of commercial sector, they follow the Soviet model they had in 50s and 60s, whereas when the key stakeholder in innovation, in bringing in new technology was the military. So the things stay the same, and people in the sphere only grow old, unfortunately. And in this sense, we don't see much progress happening. Although I do agree with the point you made about Yandex and several companies that have been successful and have proven to be major stakeholders in the market. When it comes to our attempts to build some form of Silicon Valley, et cetera, this all stems from the idea from doing things from up-down, that's called? Top-down, lost the word. Doing things top-down. So we did discuss the President Medvedev coming in here, enjoying the Silicon Valley and saying, hey, we have to do something like that. So it ended up in this large project that took a lot of financial support and investment, and not too far outside of Moscow, in Skolkovo, there was a super new cluster that was built specifically to promote and to inspire the new academia members and the startups for new works, new development, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of money were put into this new project, which unfortunately did not turn out too well, and at the moment is being mocked by the IT community because nobody actually has moved to work in there, although they did try their best, I guess. When it comes to doing educational projects, for example, they brought in a lot of distinguished professors from the MIT, again, investing a lot of money into this project in order to, for them to teach new interested Russian young scholars to be cool and bring up some startups in the future. Well, this project has been somewhat going on, but other than that, no successful companies were founded on the basis of this new institution. So that's the point. And a lot of people who are doing somewhat things related to startups and IT are either joining the large companies that are present in Moscow or St. Petersburg, or in Vladivostok, because there are a lot of Chinese companies in there. They either join the companies, the Western companies that operate in Russia, or join the already established Russian companies that do either information security or, for example, Yandex, which is much more than just a search engine at the moment, because they have grown so much to actually buy Uber in Russia, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of things going on in there. And I guess a very specific field would be the cybersecurity specialists who are either, again, moving away and living elsewhere, or joining the Kaspersky, which has humongous building and a huge staff working for them, or there are growing other Russian companies such as Group IB, for example. I don't know if you've heard of it. They do threat intelligence, they do cyber risks and threats, and work with big banks and other companies. And another, I guess, promising area for young specialists that are interested in information security, cybersecurity, and the field as a whole lies in the opportunities offered by larger companies and larger banks that open up a lot of educational programs in order to have newcoming staff that would know how to run things their way. That is done by the Sberbank, that is done by Gazprom and other state-owned and independent companies. So I'd say that. Did I answer your question?
It's a fabulous answer. Thank you. One of the subjects that we gnashed our teeth about a lot today was the renationalization of science and technology. And one of the major drivers on that for Russia is sanctions. Mike, could you talk some about the reason for the sanctions, what effect you believe they have, and under what conditions you think the U.S. ought to consider a policy change that lifts sanctions?
Well, first of all, renationalization started before sanctions. Let's be clear about that. And if you look, depending on whose measures you believe, but we were gone from 40% of the GDP being either state-controlled or state-owned to somewhere around 60% today. And that started well before. So I mentioned this guy, Khardakovsky, his company, Yukos, was a private firm. And whether he's a good guy or a bad guy, and he should have been arrested, I just want to be, there's a long, complicated history about privatization in the 90s that I talked about. But that company went from being a private company to today, the assets, it took a while to get them settled, but now they're part of Rosneft, which is a state-owned enterprise, right? It's run by Putin's friend, Mr. Sechin. That started before sanctions. Number two, this is an important point that we've talked about, and it echoes what Professor Kotkin said about the bottles and ingenuity. There is a lot of technological ingenuity going on in Russia today, but it's mostly classified, and they're really good at not just cyber intelligence and hacking into the DNC and publishing that. That was a brilliant operation, right? That was brilliant. We've never done that, to the best of my knowledge, to an adversary. Number two, signals intelligence. There's only a few countries in the world that can listen to your cell phone right now. Russia's one of them, and believe me, I know. Modernization of conventional weapons. The Russian military today is way more capable, technologically capable, than they were 20 years ago, and that has happened under Putin. And nuclear weapons. Now that Mr. Putin, in his last address, put them all on video, we can talk about them. Many of those weapons I knew about when they were classified, and those are innovative things. Torpedoes that can go hundreds of miles with a nuclear weapon on them and blow up coastal cities. Guess where we are? Those are also technological innovations that are happening. So that pernicious technologies, but they have that capacity. Under sanctions, Putin is now making an argument. Well, let's just go our own way now. We can't work with these folks. We don't. So let's make a virtue out of necessity, and cut off and just go our own way. As I already said, I'm suspicious that that's a viable strategy. There is an unintended negative consequence, in my view, of some of the sanctions, and that is of some of the individuals that were sanctioned that allegedly are part of Putin's inner circle. I disagree with that assessment. They've had to divest their assets, and many companies, some of them, Mr. Vekselberg, for instance, is one of them. And through that process, people closer to Putin are now buying those assets. And so de facto, that is leading to further nationalization and I would say anti-globalization of those kind of assets. Deripaska, again, without assigning goodness or badness to these people, same thing that's happened with his company. They have to go inside, and whether that's good or bad for Russia, I think it's bad for Russia, but that should not be an excuse, in my view, to say, well, then we should stop doing sanctions. The sanctions were put in place by the Obama administration and the Trump administration in response to Russia's pernicious behavior, in response to Russia's violation of sovereignty. Mr. Putin, your president, he likes to talk about sovereignty a lot. I've been in the room with him. He's a big fan of sovereignty. Well, I want him to be a big fan of Ukrainian sovereignty and British sovereignty and American sovereignty as well. And in response to those violations of sovereignty, there has to be a policy response. Sanctions is not the perfect response, but I think it's the necessary and moral response. And I personally want sanctions to be lifted. I'm on the sanctions list, folks. Who's more motivated than me to get sanctions lifted? I think it would be great if we lifted sanctions on Russia and Russia lifted sanctions on Americans and American companies. Fantastic. But to do that, you have to change the policy. You just can't lift them because we've decided, oh, well, we're tired. Let's just forget about Crimea. Let's forget about Mr. Skripal, that was attempted assassination there. Let's just forget about what happened in 2016 in our country. And in the name of getting along, let's move on. I don't believe that's the right course. I think the right course is change your policy and lift sanctions.
Stephen, it has been an article of faith, especially in this neighborhood, that technological innovation grows out of the messy bottom-up process of competition of ideas. And you've argued in your paper that that's not the only way to succeed at this, and that the Russians have the potential and the Chinese have the potential for a different but possibly equal or even more successful alternative of top-down, even if in narrow slices. Talk us through that.
Where does power come from in the modern world? This is going to be a little simplified, but basic ingredients are massive investment in human capital. That is a key driver of your power. The more human capital, the more powerful you are. The second is massive investment in infrastructure. And infrastructure has to be understood very broadly, not just always physical infrastructure, right? But there are other ways of connectivity. And the third is governance. And we tend to think that good governance, that is to say, open, democratic, transparent, accountable governance, is a superior form of governance. And speaking for myself, I prefer to live under that form of governance personally. And I've seen and studied people who live under authoritarian governance, and I wouldn't necessarily envy them. There are other factors, but if you put this together, the human capital, the infrastructure, and the governance, that looks like the winning formula. And therefore, if you want to do innovation, and you invest in the human capital, you build out the infrastructure, and you have good governance, the free market will take care of all the innovation you need, because private interests will allocate capital in an efficient manner such that they will hear good ideas and want to spend money on them. And if those good ideas are as good as they thought, they'll work out and make money for the investors. And so that kind of bottom-up distributive model, which is perhaps a description of the Silicon Valley that we're speaking in right now, generally is viewed as superior. If you look at the history of competition between states and of technological development, it's more complicated than that picture. The history has been, yes, that is a powerful model, the Silicon Valley model, which we uphold as the most powerful or as the only one that really works. That's clearly been borne out, that it's a powerful model. However, there's another model, and that other model looks very different. It's state control, massive state mobilization, concentration of resources, a lack of freedom, a censorship, yes, all of that, but the ability nonetheless to produce inefficiently with high levels of waste and a lack of freedom, nonetheless ability to produce certain kinds of cutting edge and in fact superior technologies. Now, this is not a philosophical statement I'm making. This is an empirical statement based upon the study of history. And since I've written about it, I could refer to the specific examples, which I'm going to omit right now. So if we triangulate between the US, China, and Russia, what do we see? We see the US model of technological innovation succeeding to a great extent. Just massive innovation all up and down. You can argue that some of it is poorly distributed. You can argue that it's misused. You can argue that we have these great social media in order to do kind of silly things with it, et cetera. I don't put a value on how we use it, but the fact that we have it. If you look at the Russia case today, it looks like the top-down model is the failure we would predict it to be. That is to say, they are not innovating in a commercial fashion successfully across multiple new technologies. They can purchase some of them, and they can block entry to foreign companies coming into Russia, like block Google, and therefore support the ability of a Russian domestic Google competitor to rise, and the domestic competitor is successful technologically. We have to admit that, just like Professor McFaul said. However, you look at the China case, they have a version of the top-down model, which is to say it's unfree, it's state-controlled, and it's massive concentration of resources where orders are given, do this, do this. They build big laboratories, they assemble a lot of people together, and they're able to succeed. They are certainly not only stealing intellectual property in China, but creating significant intellectual property. And so we have to come to grips with the fact that our understanding of what models work and what models don't work is maybe a little bit simplistic, but the Russia case is not working like the China case. So therefore, the explanation in the Russian case can't be that the top-down model always fails. There have to be some other factors, because if the Chinese can do it, now the Chinese is more complicated than I'm giving right here because we're limited in time. It's not solely a top-down model. There are other dimensions to it. But the Chinese case shows it's possible. The Russia case, it's not happening. So there are some additional factors in the Russia case besides only the top-down model that are holding them back. And that's a lot of what we discussed today.
So as Professor McFaul has to bolt out the door, I'm going to give him the last word as you're walking. One thing you would change on U.S.-Russia policy. One thing we should do differently than we are doing now as you walk out the door.
I didn't expect that. Let me have two things. One is there's not a lot of interaction between our governments and our societies right now. Most certainly, we've had periods where there's been more interaction. And we're going to disagree with Russia about some fundamental issues. I don't see, and when I say Russia, let me be clear, the Putin administration. And we should always be careful to say there's the Putin administration, then there's all of Russians, and within the Putin administration, there's lots of variation too. Russia is a complex society that's not a unitary state or a unitary society. What scares me today is how little interaction there are. I see some gentlemen who we were talking about this from Moscow yesterday. There used to be a lot more connectivity. We're going to disagree fundamentally about some really, really big things. What we can't have is conflict based on misinformation or misperception. That scares me, and so I would like to increase dialogue, even if it doesn't lead to change. The second thing I would say, in a time when you're going to disagree about most things, and in a time when we need to contain various belligerent behavior by Vladimir Putin, there is still scope for cooperation. George Shultz did it in his day during the Cold War, and I think there are some lessons to be learned there, that even when you're disagreeing on 9 out of 10 issues, maybe there's one you can agree on. And in my view, we need to really focus on nuclear arms control. Because that is a place where, whether you like it or not, we need to deal with Russia. There's a New START treaty in place. I was part of the team that helped to negotiate it. I think it's a pretty good treaty, but there are lots of people in Russia, and there are lots of people in the Trump administration that disagree with that. And then we talked about violations of the INF treaty and other dimensions of the net and mess of arms control issues. I would just say, focus on that one thing, and if we could have progress on that, maybe that might lead to progress on other things, instead of trying to change everything in the US-Russian relationship, because right now I think that kind of ambition is misplaced. And oh, by the way, nuclear weapons are the thing that we can blow up the world in. Why not concentrate on trying to reduce that probability? So 2 things, not 1. And thank you all. It's been great to be here. Bye-bye.
Professor Holloway, may I put the same question to you? Maria, move on down with us. What one thing would you change or focus on in the U.S.-Russia relationship right now?
Well, I would follow Mike on his second point on dealing with nuclear weapons and actually military-to-military contacts. The New START agreement can be extended by administrative decision. It doesn't require any action by the Congress or the Duma. It will run out in 2021. It could be extended for another 5 years. The treaty itself is being implemented, complied with by both sides, and it provides a degree of predictability and a degree actually of intelligence for each side about the other side's strategic nuclear forces. The Russians proposed that. Nikolai Patrushev, the Secretary of the Security Council, proposed it to John Bolton, but John Bolton said, well, there are other possibilities, negotiate a new treaty or go back to something like the 2002 Moscow Treaty. I won't go into the reasons why. I think those are not sensible alternatives. I think extending New START would be a good place to start. It's complicated. I've been involved in discussions of this, and there are Americans who say, well, you know, you've cheated or you're not complying with the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. So why should we, save this particular treaty? That's a serious argument, but I think it's outweighed by the advantages of having the New START continued, extended. If we go to the other treaty where there are complaints on either side, I think one Russian complaint has some substance, but the US position, which I accept, is that the Russians have violated the treaty. There, I think, I've heard from both Russians and Americans involved in this business that, in fact, serious discussion about the violations, serious discussion about whether or not the treaty, which was signed in 1987, should be amended in some ways to take account of technological change, that there are ways in which you could perhaps actually modify and keep the treaty in being. I think especially at a time when our political relationship is very bad, it would be good to have a greater degree of military-to-military contact, so that, for example, if the commander of US strategic rocket forces sees something on the other side the Russians are doing that he doesn't understand, he could pick up the phone and talk to his Russian counterpart, whom he would have met in some way, and say, explain to me what's going on here. Neither of us, neither country wants to get into a nuclear war, but there are dangers of miscalculation and of accidents, and the more one can do to provide mechanisms for preventing those from escalating, the better off we would be. We have a real common interest there. A second thing, so I'll follow Mike and say a second point. The second point is we actually had today, I thought, a very interesting Russian paper about the new technologies, and not focusing on the current situation, but rather what are the potential implications of advances in AI in the coming years. And then there's some objection, well, these technologies can be linked to intelligence, they're sensitive to discuss, but there are lots of social implications and political implications. And I think it would be good to have scientists, engineers, social scientists, political figures come together in a way to try to understand how we think about these technologies and the impact they might have in the future. That also could be productive. And I think there's this is not a matter of saying, oh, let's forget everything that's happened. It's a matter of trying to expand the areas in which in the future we might be able to cooperate.
Maria, I was struck that in all three of the Russian papers, there was an appeal to international cooperation on science and technology. As a last comment, we give you the last word as the Russian participant in our conversation. Before we go to all of your questions, where do you see the possibility for deeper cooperation on science and technology on these frontiers?
Okay, well, the official Russian position on cooperation on cyber, technology, et cetera, is to cooperate through various international organizations, first of all, the UN. That's the official position. It's all great, but I don't think it works. And I guess we can all agree on the fact that it doesn't work, and not much has happened due to this position. Where I see the possibility for cooperation, and a lot of things are happening, but they're kept quiet for in most occasions, is the cooperation between businesses in Russia and in the US, in the EU. Sometimes the agreements that are signed are multilateral. They cover all three stakeholders, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess it should be either cooperation, B2B cooperation, or the cooperation between business and government, and that would tie in the US, Russia and other countries that are interested, because when we talk about technology and the threats we covered this morning, the major losses that are experienced in this sphere are experienced by business and not by states or ordinary people. So the business faces highest cost, and I think that we should use their interest as an advantage and as a tool in order to reach any further goals on reaching overall, well, not understanding, we do understand that understanding is not our closest possibility here, but at least some first steps, they could be even small ones.
Excellent. So my friends, it is that bewitching hour when you get to hold these three folks accountable for their views, ask them any questions that you are curious about that they haven't answered, challenge anything they have said so far. Fire away. Who wants the first shot at them? Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask Professor Kotkin a question. I'm a big fan of your Stalin biographies, and I'd like to go back to the beginning of the October Revolution and the time when Russia was isolated from the West. This is in reference to Professor McFaul's point about they're going to be in big trouble if they follow Putin's strategy of isolating themselves and just try to become self-sustaining. If we go back to the 1920, 1921, when the Western powers very actively and consciously isolated Russia, and under Stalin, they were responsible for becoming self-sustaining. Seems like they did a pretty reasonable job of doing it then. Can you comment on that and carry that to Professor McFaul's point about that's a dead-end road for them to try to become self-sustaining nowadays?
All of the technology developed under Stalin, which enabled the Soviet Union to become a superpower, with few exceptions, was purchased in the West. There are some exceptions, synthetic rubber, for example, there are some, and Russians also improved some of the technology that they purchased. But the dependence on Western technology has been a characteristic of the entire non-Western world in modern history. That's why we have this dynamic of needing to acquire Western technology, but not wanting to become like the West institutionally. Today, China looks like it may, we don't know, it looks like it may be able to develop that technology domestically and still hold the Western institutions at bay. Stalin purchased a lot of that technology. Let me make a point on US-Russia relations and bring it up to the conversation we're having. So relations are poor. When were relations between Russia and the United States good for a sustained period of time? And the answer is before the United States became a great power, before the 1870s. In 1776, relations were excellent. As the United States became a great power, relations have been difficult. There have been moments where relations improved. There was a World War II alliance. It wasn't really an alliance. They didn't have joint military operations. There was tremendous suspicion on both sides, and it didn't last after the end of the war for reasons that we're not going to go into here. The Cold War was wound down. There was a brief period of pretty solid relations that Secretary Shultz and President Reagan and then President Bush, the father, were responsible for. But for the most part, relations have been difficult. It's not a misunderstanding. It is a fundamental clash of interests and of values. The United States grand strategy is don't permit any power dominating its region. Nobody should dominate Europe. Nobody should dominate Eurasia. Nobody should dominate East Asia. That's U.S. grand strategy boiled down to its minimum, its bottom line. What's Russian grand strategy? Russian grand strategy is dominate Eurasia. It's a fundamental clash of interests. In addition, deeper than that, there's a fundamental clash of values, which is to say, the highest value in the United States is freedom, especially freedom from the state. Whether we practice this value or we're hypocritical is another story. The highest value in Russia is the state. So there's a fundamental clash of values. So the relationship is not going to be one of lovey-dovey ever. However, we can manage the clash of interests and the clash of values much better than we're currently managing them. And that's the goal. So that's what Secretary Shultz and President Reagan proved in a previous epoch. So I know where we are, and I'm going to say it anyway. President Trump's instincts are good. He wants to get to a better place in the relationship with Russia. Now, you can argue about his motives. Maybe his motives are suspect. Maybe there's all sorts of stuff in those motives that we don't like. I'm not going to speculate on that. I don't have sufficient information to know precisely what his motives are. But I like the instinct, which is to say to get to a better place in Russia, with Russia. And, you know, you've heard some recommendations about how that could be done. But we have to be careful about not getting pie in the sky about the better place we can get to. It's about managing the differences. It's not about all of a sudden becoming like each other, right? And so the Russians have a dependency on the West because of Western technology and finance, and that will return, and they will make outreach to us. That's what happens every time. After the anti-Westernism comes the makeup, the kiss and make up because of technology and financial transfer. I think that'll come. Whether it comes under the Putin regime or a post-Putin regime, of course, I can't predict the future. But we need to be careful about, you know, what we think we can achieve with them. So let's work on practical issues, reducing the tension, increasing the cooperation within a realistic understanding of what's possible, right? Anyway, I don't know. I could go on, but if I go on, the moderator will get mad.
So it is with some trepidation that I disagree with you
Let's hear
about
it.
U.S.-Russian relations, in particular about how good they were before 1870, because I see Lisa Cobb's out there, so I cannot resist pointing out that the policy that would become the Monroe Doctrine in 1823 actually was developed in reaction to a Russian claim of exclusive economic zones around Fort Ross and in what is now Alaska. So even before we were a great power, we had our moments with
As I said, in 1776, relations were excellent. And so I think we're actually in agreement. But since 1870, it's been hopeless.
There we go. Other questions, my friends? Yes, sir.
In a privatization discussion, and the sense I was getting from a lot of the folks there, and they were very careful how they put it, said we speak Russian, but we're no longer going to be teaching our children Russian, especially in Kazakhstan. They're changing the language. And it seemed to me in both Uzbekistan, which has recently opened up, and in Kazakhstan, they're playing a very careful game because they're in the customs, well, at least Kazakhstan's in the customs union, that they're saying, we don't want to say no to Russia, we want to say yes to the entire world. So in other words, I'm friends, not only friends with you, I'm friends with everybody, right? In a way that's sort of the game that they're playing. What is a long-term relationship with Russia trying to pull in the former Soviet republics and sort of try to sort of be first among equals there, and sort of their response to pull away, right? Because what we're seeing is a lot of state-owned enterprises, Russian state-owned enterprises, especially the power industry, going in Kazakhstan and owning a large amount of the coal, going to Uzbekistan now and bringing money to Uzbekistan, saying you need our money. Uzbeks are saying, can the Americans come in, right? Because quote unquote, they didn't say counterbalance, but that's what I mean. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Anybody want to take a whack at that? Maria, why don't you start us?
I'll start on that. I think Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan are trying to play smart, especially not only with regard to Russia, but taking into account the fact that China has been much more active in the region recently, if we're talking about economy, different projects, etc., etc. Back to your point on not teaching our kids Russian. Well, probably that's a good point, but what they do is they still send their kids to study to Moscow universities. And I don't see that changing because, of course, only wealthier people can afford to do that. But if we're talking about, okay, if we don't send our kids to study to Moscow, where do we send them? Taking into consideration the difference in prices between Russian education and, let's say, the US education, I'm sure they are going to stick with the Russian option for a while now. And that would lead us to the fact that the kids will need to learn Russian and will either will come to Russia and catch up on that in Moscow, or will learn it from the very beginning. Because I don't see Kazakh kids joining the English language program at MGIMO, for example. That would kind of look funny.
David, thoughts on this?
I think if you come from a smaller country and live next to a big one or to two big ones, then you do need a kind of careful policy of trying to secure your own independence by careful diplomacy. So I think, yes, cultural I mean, I think Russia doesn't have, well, maybe there's a slight qualification to be made in the case of Kazakhstan and the Russian-speaking population in the north of Kazakhstan. But Russia Soviet Union didn't object mightily to the fact that the Central Asian countries became independent. In fact, they didn't so much want to become independent. So I think the interesting issue will be really China and Russia, how they will manage their interests and their involvement in that region. And that's, I think, the Sino-Russian relationship is an extremely important one for not only for those two countries and neighboring countries, but for the world as a whole. And I think one of great interest because of the way in which it has been developing.
Other questions? Amber. I'm sorry, Lisa, go ahead. And then Amber.
I'd just like to ask a question, really, of all of you experts on this subject. I have been so puzzled by the emphasis on the Russian use of technology in malicious ways, but in petty ways, in a sense. Spoiler kinds of behavior, at least in relation to things like the American elections and some other things. And I wonder to what extent some of this goes back to very early, in a way, Russian history. I mean, when one thinks of Peter the Great, he wanted to bring Russia into modern technological competence, the founding of the original Russian academies and that sort of thing back in the 18th century. And so how much of this is about Russia being recognized and having the dignity that so often historically it has felt that the West has denied it? Is there some part of what's happened that is a part of this larger sort of complicated quest for respect? And if I don't get respect, I'm going to show you. And so I've been struggling to understand what's the material interest of Russia at this time in using technology, especially cyber kinds of technologies, in the ways that it has.
Anyone like to take a whack at that? Maria's looking
I'll
hesitant.
I'll elaborate.
I think let me try. I think it's a profound question. And it comes, I think, a little bit to something Steve Kotkin was talking about, differences in values. An issue that I think was very important at the end of the Cold War and after the end of the Cold War. And the experience of the collapse of the state was, I think, I think the common American view was, oh, that's great, this is wonderful. But for many people who lived in the Soviet Union, this was really a terrible thing, a disaster. I'm always struck by Svetlana Alexeyeva's writing about the reactions of people living in Russia or in Ukraine and Belarus to the collapse and the breakup of things. But apart from even those practical difficulties, a sense of humiliation and a wanting, a need for respect, not to be mentored to and told, we know how to do things, let us tell you how to do them. And I think some of the resistance may come from a feeling that, no, we have a lot to be proud of, and this comes back to the issue of legitimation as well. I mean, one of the fundamental decisions after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it seems to me, and I don't think it was a top-down decision, I think it was a sense in the political classes, Russia is a great power. Yes, we're no longer the Soviet Union, but we're a great power. We were a great power before the Soviet Union existed. We were a great power in the days of Catherine the Great. And so we have a lot to be proud of, and we need to be respected. And I think sensitivity to that has been important. I don't want to say that's the whole thing, but I think it's an element in the relationship which it can be easy to overlook, but actually is extremely important.
The Clinton Library just declassified the transcripts of telephone conversations between President Clinton and Boris Yeltsin during the time period around NATO expansion. And I was really struck reading the transcripts at how much they bear out what you are saying, David, where Yeltsin keeps saying, we really don't want you to do this. This is really going to matter to us. And President Clinton, in his charming way, keeps saying, but no, we're going to do this. You guys should be all right with it. And the talking past of that and the Russian, I do think in Russian foreign policy choices subsequent to the decisions about NATO expansion, it becomes more and more prominent as a grievance, this issue of respect. And I suspect it will come up again quite strongly because American attention has moved to focus on a rising China, and that leaves Russia marginal to our interests in some ways, and in ways that I think the Russian government is unlikely to find adequate to the stature that they want. Stephen, do you have any thoughts on this?
Good, I'm good with both of the things you said.
Okay. Amber, last question.
I would appreciate it if all of the members of the panel, including Kori, could comment on the role of the Ukraine and Crimea as Russia emerges in the greater world.
So I didn't hear the question.
Ukraine and
Russia
Crimea.
and Crimea as Russia emerges in the greater world. This is your wheelhouse, Steve. Start.
In 1919, there was the Paris Peace Treaty, known as the Treaty of Versailles. And there's a lot of argument about the Treaty of Versailles. The argument is, on the one hand, that the British failed to implement the peace. They didn't have the willpower to force the peace to hold. And the predominant argument against that is that the peace was punitive, it blamed Germany only, it led to instability, and is partly responsible for the rise of Hitler. Both of those arguments are irrelevant. The Peace Treaty of 1919 was imposed in a unique situation, an anomalous situation. Germany was flat on its back, and Russia was flat on its back simultaneously. It's the only time since Bismarck's unification of Germany in 1870-71 that that's happened. So the peace was imposed against Germany without the participation of Russia, which couldn't last no matter whether it was punitive or not, no matter if the British had more willpower or not. Because one of those countries for sure was going to come back as a great power, or maybe even both. And in fact, both Germany and Russia came back as a great power within a single generation. The British spent the entire period between World War I and World War II trying to fix this treaty and bring Germany in, and even maybe bring the Soviet Union in. And they failed. The British were the first revisionists of the Versailles Treaty, which was not going to work. 1991 settlement was imposed when Germany was unified and Russia was flat on its back. Russia could do nothing about the settlement that was imposed. It didn't like the settlement. It complained about the settlement. Boris Yeltsin told the Ukrainians that if you're going to go independent, you're going to give us Crimea. Boris Yeltsin said this in 1991. He couldn't do anything about it. He didn't have the wherewithal to oppose the 1991 settlement. Fast forward, Russia regained the great power status, not the greatest power, not a first-ranked power, but a significant power. And now it can do something about the 1991 settlement that it doesn't like. And it is doing it. It has both the will, but now also the capacity to rearrange the terms of the settlement. So here we are as the United States. What's our position going to be? Are we going to try to hold the 1991 settlement in place because we imposed it? Or are we going to allow or even participate in an adjustment of the 1991 settlement? Now, Russia's already taken Crimea. Crimea is going back to Ukraine the day after Texas goes back to Mexico. The next day, the Ukrainians will be able to reclaim Crimea, right? So I'm not sure we understand these events properly. Is the situation in Ukraine tragic? Yes. Was the 1991 settlement stable? No. It was not, is not, and will be less stable going forward. And so we want a settlement. This goes back to my earlier point and to the great history that Secretary Shultz was involved in, a key player in. We want a settlement in which the Russians are self-interested in upholding the settlement. We want to incentivize them to be partners in stabilization of the world. When the Russians raise that issue, we respond by saying, but you're in violation. You've broken the settlement. You've taken Ukrainian territory, etc. And the Russians respond by saying, we want a settlement that's more just, not the 1991 settlement, which was, of course, followed by the expansion of NATO, right? And so we're now in this non-debate or non-intersecting debate dilemma where we're trying to uphold a settlement that we can no longer fully uphold and that the Russians can do something about. And so as the Ukrainian peace unfolds, it needs to be put in a larger framework of the post-91 settlement. Ukraine is going to be a partial loser in that process. And that's not going to go down well with those people who are patriotically inclined to support Ukraine. The problem with great power politics is it doesn't always have solely win-win situations.
Very seldom has been.
And therefore, you need to get to a stability where you don't have further Crimeas. You don't have further tragic outcomes. You don't increase the tragedy. You at least don't increase it, maybe even you decrease it. So I feel deeply for what's happened. The Ukrainian people don't deserve what's happened. But let me also add that the Ukrainian elites destroyed that country before the Russians put their hand in there to worsen the situation. So it's not a one-sided situation of blame. Nor can we defend Western civilization on the quicksand of Ukraine. It's a very difficult place to take a stand, Ukraine. And so, in answer to your question, I would prefer that it hadn't happened. Now that it has happened, I want to put it in a larger framework of world stabilization. And you have to be careful there not to reward misbehavior, but you also have to be careful not to uphold a settlement that's anomalous and can't really hold no matter how much willpower you have.
So while all of us would love to answer this question, we are standing between you and drinks and pizza in the adjoining room. I would like to ask you to do two things with me. First, I should announce that on October 29th, the next of Secretary Schultz's conversations about the changing world and technology are coming up. I believe Gary Roughhead is moderating a discussion on China. Is that right, Secretary Schultz? Okay, so mark your calendars for October 29th. And the second thing I would like to ask your help on is thanking both these terrific panelists and terrific George Shultz, who brought them all together and made this conversation possible. Secretary Schultz, would you close this out, please?
Well, there's pizza and wine in the next room. That's the best closing I can tell you.
Thank you, my friends.